Okay, as I mentioned, conducting this presentation tonight on the new requirements for registering swimming pools and spas. The new legislation has been brought in recently, and it's basically to improve safety around swimming pools and spas. There's some pretty damning statistics in regards to fatalities associated with drownings, pools and spas. And councils are now required to establish and maintain a register for pools and spas in their municipality. And that basically covers pools that are associated with houses, apartment buildings, and motels and hotels. Swimming pools are the leading location for drowning deaths amongst young children in Australia, according to Royal Life Saving Victoria, and they account for 52% of all drowning deaths. As you can see there from the graph, from 2002 to 2018, 251 people, or 259 children died in swimming pool related accidents, drownings, I should say. Which is, as I said before, is a pretty scary stat. And it's obviously something that government is able to control and I guess police in a way, hence the new requirements for registration. Owners are required to register their pool or spa with council and obtain a compliance certificate to show that they meet a minimum set of safety requirements. Now, this is in line with setups in other states. As you can see on the screen there, there's a compliance certificate that they use in New South Wales, as well as one that is used in Queensland. So it's certainly not an unusual process that has been introduced, and it's again based on the statistics. I think it's probably something that's well overdue. The new requirements apply to swimming pools and spas that can hold more than 300 ml of water, and so these can include permanent pools, either above or below ground, indoor pools, hot tubs, and I guess the contentious one is some types of relocatable pools. So some relocatable pools, such as those which require no assembly other than inflation and not subject to the barrier requirements. So the pool that we see in the picture there is a basic blow-up pool, albeit a fairly big version of a blow-up pool, but a blow-up pool nonetheless. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that pools which have multiple components, such as this pool, which has a filter and stands around it, or require assembly, are required to be provided with a pool safety barrier. Now, I guess the thinking behind this is that if I flick back to the other pool, the water after a certain period of time in that pool will get fairly manky. So the inclination would be to pack it away. Whereas a pool such as the one on the screen now, I think is, under the legislation, is considered more permanent because it has a filter which will clean the water, which enables it to stay there longer. It has some fairly substantial bracing there as well. So it's considered more a permanent pool as opposed to the inflatable one in the previous photo. So that, in my experience thus far, that seems to be the most contentious issue in regards to these new requirements, as to whether a certain type of pool requires a fence or not, and thus is included as part of the registration process. This is basically a graph of the process, and I'll run through each of these items individually so that you can sort of get an understanding of the process involved. I will make mention that I'm running a follow-up session at the same time next week. So I guess it would be good if you could take a bit of time to just digest the information that I provide you in this presentation and come back with any questions that you might have. We'd be happy to run through those with you next Wednesday. So the first part in this process is to register the pool with council. So part of that process involves contacting council's building department, completing the registration form, and paying the appropriate registration fee. And I will say that both council and the VBA are excellent sources of additional information, as well as my presentation, as well as my seminar next week. So do contact them. I know the VBA has a lot of in-depth information on this process as well. So log on to their website and have a look. The next part in the process is getting someone to complete the barrier inspection. Now, the barrier inspection can only be completed by a registered building surveyor or a registered building inspector. Now, this is very important, an important step in the process, and it's particularly important that the person completing the inspection is suitably registered. I have heard of instances recently in various councils where people are passing themselves off as appropriately qualified inspectors to conduct these assessments, but they're not registered, they don't have the appropriate registration. So I will reiterate that it's important, I think, that before you get someone to do this inspection, that you do check their qualifications and check their registration. You can actually check building surveyors and building inspectors registration on the VBA website. So if you go under, I think it's search building practitioner and then search their name, it will show you if they're registered or not and if their registration is current. So that's, I think, a valuable step in this process, because as I said, we have had instances of people conducting these assessments without being suitably qualified, and it pretty much renders the inspection report useless, and it's also a waste of money because they're not appropriately qualified. So just something to keep in mind. The next stage is in this process is we're going to assume that the inspection was compliant, and the inspector will assess that against the applicable standard, and it's based on the date of construction or amendment of the pool safety barrier. The intent of the pool regulations is to require compliance with law at the time the barrier was built or altered. And it is necessary to determine the date the pool or spa was constructed. The regulations use the term applicable barrier standard as representing the set of technical requirements that were in force at the date of construction of the pool or spa or later date on which building work was carried out to alter the barrier. So it's basically the last, you take the date, it's the last date of work that was completed as part of the pool or pool safety barrier to determine what legislation you are required to comply with. The next step in this process is that a certificate of barrier compliance will be issued by the person who conducts the inspection. And this comes back to the barrier inspection point that I raised before. If you have someone who is not registered as a building surveyor or building inspector, the certificate of barrier compliance is pretty much useless. So again, I will just reiterate, please be mindful and do your due diligence as to who you're employing to conduct this. But in this instance, let's assume that the person who conducted the assessment was suitably registered. They will issue a certificate of barrier compliance, which basically gives your safety barrier a tick. You then lodge that with council. Now it's required that the owner lodges this with council within 30 days of issue of the certificate, and a fee is paid to council as part of that process. And then once you've done that, the next step is that you basically do the same process, but in 4 years' time. So the certificate gives you 4 years, and basically this allows, well, this takes into consideration any additional works that might happen over that time to change the level of compliance of the barrier. For example, fences might get, side boundary fences might get replaced, walls on boundaries might get removed, or things are added next to a fence that could be considered to assist someone to climb over that fence, or fences just deteriorate over time. So that's the thinking behind the 4 years. Now, if we move on and go back and assume that a barrier inspection took place and the barrier was considered non-compliant based on the relevant legislation, the inspector will issue a statement listing the areas of non-compliance to be rectified, the time frame in which the works are to be completed, and that's a maximum of 60 days, and the date of re-inspection. So it basically gives you a timeline and a list of requirements of what you need to do to ensure that that barrier is brought up to a compliant level. Once the works are then completed in accordance with the assessment, and then the barrier is re-inspected as part of the process. Now, the barrier re-inspection, I would imagine, will incur another fee. So it's probably within the best interests of the owner to ensure that the required works are completed that were listed on the letter of non-compliance, to reduce the number of re-inspections that need to take place. Because otherwise, if you just do small bits, then the inspector's going to come back and re-inspect, but there'll still be items outstanding. So it'd be a good idea financially, even, just to ensure that the works listed on the letter of non-compliance are completed all at once, and then you just get one barrier re-inspection. And then the process, the process follows the compliant chain that I've just spoken about, in that certificate of barrier compliance is issued, it's lodged with council, and then another one doesn't need to happen for 4 years. Another point is that existing pools can be decommissioned, obviously to the satisfaction of council, which then means they can be removed from the council register. So you can see in the picture, there's a pretty crummy looking pool. Let's say, for example, that was on the register, but the owner, for whatever reason, didn't want to maintain it, didn't want to maintain the fence. They do have the option to decommission the pool, again, to the satisfaction of council, and decommission it. And in this instance, they've decided to just backfill it. But if that is a path that you are considering going down, I'd highly recommend speaking to the council prior to starting that process to ensure you understand what their requirements are to satisfy them. But there will be different requirements, I would imagine, in different situations. For example, you might have a spa on a deck that simply needs to be removed. Whereas in the instance here, you have a pool, which obviously needs to be infilled, and then the fence removed. It was fairly short, sharp presentation tonight, but I was conscious not to overload people with information or highly technical information. As I've mentioned, the Building Department and Council and the VBA are excellent resources to do a bit of further research should you require. As I mentioned, the VBA has a lot of practice notes and documentation in regards to the process, and it goes into a lot more detail in regards to fines that you might receive if you don't follow the process, and even court appearances and that sort of thing should you decide not to follow that process. So again, I do encourage you to contact council or the VBA for a bit more information. That completes session 1 in regards to this information series. Next week, as I mentioned, we are having a Q&A session at the same time next Wednesday at 7 o'clock on the 17th of March. And I'd encourage you to submit any questions that you might have between now and then to council. And my understanding is we'll have a few different building surveyors attending that, and we'll be able to run through the questions and provide some answers in regards to it. Now, I think the main focus is the pool and spa, the new regulations for pool and spa. But if you do have a general building inquiry that you would like us to address as part of that information session, feel free to send it through to us, and we'll do our best to answer. Having worked in council before, I understand that there are a lot of general building questions that people might have. So yeah, get those into us, and as I said, we'll do our best to address those as part of the session 2. Well, that's all from me tonight. Thank you for attending. We managed to get through without any children fighting or dogs barking. So I might go and give them a pat on the back now, and have a good evening, and I'll hopefully see you next weekend. Next Wednesday. Thank you.